Neal Stephenson said something in this conversation that I keep coming back to. He said that the ability to tell a story around a campfire, to take your own near death experience and hand it to someone else so that they don't have to live it themselves, is probably the most powerful evolutionary advantage a species could have. If you think about what that means, before writing, before the internet, before any of this modern world, humans were already building a shared memory, a way to survive together by sharing what one person learned. That's what this show is about. That's what Autograph is about, the company that have started since the last season that now powers the show. It's not just about recording conversations, it's about recording the kind of knowledge that otherwise would be lost. It doesn't fit into a textbook. It's the kind of knowledge that comes from being there, from being learned. Neal has been everywhere. He has one of the most famous sci fi authors in history. He has an amazing track record of prophecies coming true, apart from being employee number one at Blue Origin and, amazing technical contributions to gaming, VR, and just an infinity of futurism. I was very lucky to sit down with him in a conversation that went deep. Welcome back. This is Rabbit Hole Research. Mr. Neal Stephenson, thank you so much for being on the show. So glad to have you here.
Good to be here. How are you?
Doing all right. I've been counting myself very lucky that our paths crossed in such a serendipitous way, and very excited to jam a little bit around narrative storytelling and thinking about narrative as a technology that has an evolution and an arc. And I know that this is something that you've thought about a lot, and you've participated in the canon. I think that your works have now, count as canon in the Western world, and so it'd be fun to talk about that evolution and sort of see how not only you see it as as a technology arc, but also how your process has evolved as you've appraised this. So I have a fun question just to break the ice, which is when
Sure.
you know who do you write for these days?
Um, I mean, I'm sitting there alone as I do it, so the I'm usually not super conscious of what the audience might be. I think, you know, uh, th- by definition, an audience has a large number of, hopefully, a large number of participants, and they might all have different interests, different tastes, and so. I try to write something that I find interesting in the moment because I'm always there. I don't have to send it out to a focus group or a test reader or anything like that. Um, but in general, my approach isn't super focused on thinking about the audience all the time.
Yeah, and I think I was sneakily trying to get at this ambient observer that is always present, that is you, that is at the intersection of, like in the commonalities between everybody who reads your books. There is a part of you that resonates with someone else. Um, and I think that there's something there that's really interesting to me in how that sense of self is persistent across time and across generations. And, we start seeing patterns in narrative that sort of transcend.
Well, that's certainly relevant to what you're working on right now. So yeah, I can see why you'd have that take on it. But please go ahead.
No, but I think that there's something there about the this fine treatment of the ego as you're the consumer of your own production, and I think that there's an evolution there that is worth exploring. Um, and
Okay.
it reminded me of this question that we had at the Long Journey Ventures retreat. That was, who are you performing for? And like if you're not really conscious about that question, it's kind of funny to think about who you're performing for. And I think that it's just an interesting backdrop in this context of narrative as technology, where, well, how do we measure the efficiency of that technology? And maybe like that's the place where we can start. How do you measure the success of narrative?
Well, for one thing, I do think that the mental processes of a storyteller are different from those of a story reader, and so the um, so I don't think that for what I do that it would be productive or helpful to be focused on the reader experience. I have to be focused on the writer experience, which is a different process in a lot of ways. Um, so the so I'm just sitting there alone with pen in hand, you know, sort of spilling out sentences in a way that satisfies me as a storyteller. And if that happens to align with what readers like to see, then we're having a good day. We got a good product market fit, as we say in the tech world. For the most part, I've been fortunate in that fit has existed.
Oh, I mean, certainly so. And there's something to be said about the process, which I think, I mean, it's probably a bit tired to ask like what your writing process is, but maybe there's a more interesting question around how has your process evolved, or how does the production of Polystan and that universe compare to the early days of prior work?
Well, I think it uh, hasn't changed that much. I think I'm more confident in what I do now. And so I have a better sense of what's going to work, what's going to, um, when uh, when you've got kind of less experience under your belt, you're more apt to kind of go down blind alleys, make mistakes, maybe spend time on things that aren't going to pan out. Like a classic example is just to over research a thing, and then you've got a bunch of material that is really extraneous and not that interesting, and has to be removed. So I don't think the process has changed a lot, except in the sense that I'm just a little bit more efficient because I have a pretty good sense of what's working, what's going to work, and um, I also I think an important thing that comes with that experience is just having a certain amount of confidence that I am going to get to the end of the book. So
Mm.
uh, when you're starting out, um, you're always kind of wondering, can I do it? Am I producing enough? Geez, I only wrote X many words today, or in the last week. I need to write more. I shouldn't take any time off. I shouldn't hit the pause button to go off and think about something or do some research. And um, over time, for me, that kind of anxiety has gone away because I know that once I do get into a productive mode, I will produce a lot of material and I will get to the end of the book that I'm writing before too much time has gone by.
There's an interesting question there around, the gardener versus the architect and how much you need the telos of the whole message enough to support the production and versus
Yep.
discovering the stuff that just happens to be beautiful along the way that lets you as a in the
Hmm.
relationship between author and writer experience or wander about the world. Where do you fall in that spectrum of allowing the serendipity or like the prose to guide where the narrative goes versus the end light at the end of the tunnel? This is the
Yeah.
outline that I need to follow.
Yeah. Understood. The I think that a certain amount of telos is is necessary. Like you do need to have a sense of what the end of the project is going to be. Whether it's, what's the end of this book or the end of this chapter. Um, and the um, as long as that's there, I think uh, that that the gardening approach tends to be most productive. The because at the end of the day, um, you still are having to produce the work, one letter, one word at a time, right? I mean, that's just a given. And so, I mean, I've always seen a close parallel between the writing process and the process of writing computer code.
Mm.
Um, because in each of those cases, you're, typing it out one character at a time, and there's no other way to actually enter the code into the machine. But if you don't have a sense of the architecture of what you're building that's constantly there, um, then you're not moving closer to any actual uh, useful purpose. So you kind of have to have both. But I would say um, like um, a common error, and again, this goes to this topic of confidence and experience. Common error is to over stress the telos, what's the big architecture of what I'm doing, and then get stuck on being able to actually produce the work,
Mm.
one word and one sentence at a time. So the closer you can stay to that end of it, I think the better off you're going to be, and the more opportunities you're opening up for serendipity along the way.
Mm.
Creative excursions that might not have been part of the original teleological scheme that was in your head,
Mhm.
but that in a lot of cases can actually um, really make or break the quality of the finished product.
Mhm. And I mean, I have to double click on this idea that you just brought up about computer code and narrative or fiction. And I mean, the parallels are definitely present. The narrative is computer
Yeah.
code for human software. Um, how
Hmm.
much do you think about the effect of the software that you write for human brains?
Sorry, I had a noise that I just didn't get the last part of your sentence.
Oh, and then like, how much do you think about the effect, the subjective effect that you like, before and after difference, uh, in a human reader, be it yourself going through the authorship exercise or someone who reads your book that has a new perspective evolved because of something they encountered in your work.
Well, again, I think it would be sort of paralyzing to think about that very much during the
Mm.
actual process. And I think it creates a little bit of a risk that you end up producing a work that's meant to be a, a, a tool,
Mm.
kind of the utilitarian approach
Mm.
to books. And um, so, so in general, I tend to shy away from thinking about those effects for uh, a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think it would help me.
Mhm.
Um, well, it certainly wouldn't help me. It probably hurt, and I think that uh, in general, readers can be quite sensitive to any perception that
Mhm.
that a book that they're reading is an axe grinder,
Mm,
that the um, I mean, this is a, a problem, um, particularly in progressive spaces of this tendency to want to tell people what to think,
mhm,
and nobody likes to be told what to think, particularly if it's being done in kind of a sneaky way. And so, um, and so the risk of always thinking about what effect a book is going to have on people is that it begins to show through, and
mm,
people begin to say, Stevenson's trying to sell me something here, and then once that's a kind of breaking of trust
mm,
in a way between the reader and the writer, and once that's broken, there's no fixing it.
mhm. No, I think that's so valid and valuable. And the reason I asked was because I'm interested in like the origins of narrative as a construct. Like and if you go back to 200,000 years ago when we operated on oral history, there was this balance
Yeah.
of entertainment, social cohesion, mythology and religious, adjacent stuff that was designed to engineer society in a certain way so that
Hmm.
pretty utilitarian goals, right? Like essentially provide for the weak, enhance the strength of the strong, figure out how to marshal
Yeah.
resources and things like that. And so I guess my question was more geared around, um, and how did we evolve from this very Spartan world of, story as a last resource almost to story as an entertainment device that has side effects that may be illustrative of other stuff. And it may be,
Yeah.
like there may be genuine gigantic alpha in literature today. The people who read certain books may be quote unquote better off because of the peace of mind it gives them, the frameworks that it gives them, so on and so forth. But we've built all this architecture around writing, media, books, tapes, all kinds of archival stuff to preserve knowledge.
Hmm.
But there's a transition there that I think is really interesting in the form of narrative itself. I just wanted to know if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, the my theory of where narrative comes from, which is just me making shit up. It's not based on any hard research or anything, but is that if you think about it, the ability to share those narratives over the campfire 200,000 years ago is it's hard to imagine a more powerful evolutionary advantage that a species
Mm,
could possibly have, um, because you can tell the story about how um, you almost got eaten by a hyena, and the under other circumstances, the only way that the other people listening, the other people in your community, could learn that would be to narrowly escape being eaten by a hyena, which is not a great way to learn things. But if you can essentially uh, take your experience and convert it into language, and then um, sort of make an infinite number of copies of it
mm,
by virally spreading it to the people in your campfire circle, then a species that's capable of doing that has got an evolutionary advantage that's second to none. So I think that's where it comes from. That's for me seems like a plausible explanation of why at a certain point in history our brains suddenly got really big, um, and we turn into a completely different and
mm,
completely dominant species. So I think that's where it comes from, and then um, once it's there, once we've all kind of got it as a sort of hardwired capacity in our brains, then you can work with it in different ways. Not every single story that you tell has to be a survival narrative about hyenas or whatever. You can tell stories that that serve other purposes. And some of those purposes may be just pure entertainment. Um, but even in the field of stories that are entertaining, it's possible for those, if it's done right, possible for those to carry a kind of payload
Hmm.
that's useful in other ways. You just don't want to be too obvious about it. Like I'm thinking back to, kind of favorite um, classic books of the 19th century, Dumas, Dickens, Jane Austen, and those are um, can be very entertaining stories in their own right. But as you're experiencing them and as you're reading them, you're sort of learning things about the world. You're learning things about human character, about you know uh, uh, good characters and bad characters, and how to recognize them, how to deal with them. Um, so it's a kind of more elevated version of the hyena story, where the threat model in this case isn't wild animals, who are coming to eat you, but it's people within your society who may be deceptive, who may be untrue, and sort of that you need to be warned about, um, so that if you encounter people like that in your life, you'll sort of be able to recognize them and match them up against patterns you've seen in reading literature, and hopefully avoid, making mistakes that could have really terrible consequences for you and your family.
No, I think, yeah, I'm really interested in this tension between the payload that you're talking about, where,
Yeah, yeah,
like you, this is probably foreshadowing for later in the conversation, but I'm really interested in the concept of this payload as it relates to AI and training systems, where the real target of a payload in modern literature could be the other fellow human that needs to, have their priors updated in a certain way. But probably more impactfully, it is really about these training systems that are going to be at the very central node of technology in the coming years. And, what is the payload architecture required to influence that world? Um, but there's another thread here too that I think is interesting. Once you have the democratization of storytelling, and it's not just the priest or the chieftain that can tell the story, and it's anybody can sort of share their lived experience. There are these underlying grooves in narrative that keep appearing, the allusion to the good
hmm
and bad, the dark night of the soul, the frameworks like the hero with a thousand faces, and
The hero journey
archetypes and
stuff. Yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah,
And what do you make of those like primitives in narrative? Like as somebody whose life has been like, how do you play that tapestry of musical instruments? Um,
yeah,
how do you relate to them, and what do you think they are? Where do they come from? That kind of stuff.
yeah. Yeah, the well, to sort of rewind just to the beginning of what you said, I suspect it's always been pretty democratic, because basically anyone around that campfire who has got a good yarn to tell and is good at telling it will immediately command the attention of everyone who's there. Um, and so I guess if it's a really authoritarian situation, then there might be ways of forcing those people to shut up. Um, but um, but it is uh, the ability to tell stories is something that's kind of, I think, pretty randomly and widely distributed across the population. And when we've all run into raconteurs in our lives, right? And they're not necessarily people who went to a writer's workshop to learn how to tell stories. It's just natural. They start telling a story and you're like, or you're overhearing them on the bus or whatever. And it's like, holy shit, this is a really engaging yarn. And then we know other people, who just cannot tell a story to save their lives, and has nothing to do with intelligence or whether they're a good or bad person. You know, it's just a knack that some people have. So the I've already forgotten the latter half of your
Well,
question.
the primitives and the
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's I don't think I have it here, but Joseph Campbell's obviously the person that we associate with the hero's
Mhm,
journey, and some of the primitives that you're talking about. Uh, he uh, he wrote, he produced a series of books. They're big picture books. They're coffee table books.
mm,
They're skinny. There's like five. It's a series of five books, and it's uh, it's like a precursor to the hero's journey stuff. But he's kind of telling the story of the transition in human societies from early hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies,
mm,
and basically that, according to him, um, in a lot of different societies, at the moment when this transition happens from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies, you start to see the appearance of the sacrifice as an
mm,
important thing. The theory being, I guess, that now you're sort of subject to the whims of weather,
mm,
rainfall, and all of that. And so you're at the mercy of these, mysterious forces you can't control. And somehow people come up with the idea that the way to get what you want is to appease the gods by sacrificing. And eventually that gets turned into symbolic sacrifices
mm,
like um,
mhm.
the communion wine and the wafer in Christian society. So there are these, you can go back if you're into this stuff, semiotics
Mhm,
and that kind of thing. You can sort of go back and look for uh, places where those grooves or those archetypes might have come from. Obviously, Jung is a big name in archetypology,
mhm,
and it's a fun, interesting exercise. I I try to avoid being overly conscious of that stuff. I mean,
mm.
I'm sure it's in my books. It's kind of hard not to,
If there might have been
that
a character somewhere called hero protagonist.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's kind of inevitable that that stuff will find its way into any story that's worth telling or that people are interested in hearing. And so what matters is the friends you make along the way. Like what are the new what are the new twists that you can apply
Mm.
to it, and how can you have fun with it? But to really study it is that's what. I mean, there are whole university departments full of people
Oh
who kind
yeah.
of dig into the deep history of these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly enjoy the exercise of trying to figure out what was the process that led to the world that we inherited? Like why does the day have 24 hours, the year has 365 days? Like these things come from somewhere, and it's this very much mangled evolution of oral history that has been structured into codified into different media. And I was talking to a friend about a month ago, and we were talking about the archetypes. There's a very mathematically inclined friend who basically has two frameworks to look at life. He understands reality as either narrative or math. And he dropped this line
Okay.
that that was the archetypes are the eigenvalues of the matrix.
Oh my God. Well, that's a good. So that's a very mathy thing that that's worth trying to unpack, I think, because it's a good insight. Um,
Hmm.
the I mean, let me see if I can
Hmm.
uh, re re-express that. There's a um, I did a thing when I was at Magic Leap. I was trying to we were working on a project in augmented reality that was going to use gesture recognition. So you basically, by moving your arm around in a particular way, you could create a magic spell.
Hmm.
Okay, so the and so we had these controllers that were 6 DOF controllers, so 6 degrees of freedom. Um, the position and orientation of the controller at any given time could be summarized by 6 numbers. And the so we captured a bunch of we would have people, we would sort of show people what a gesture was supposed to look like. And then we'd have them do it over and over again and capture a bunch of data from different people, different statures, different body types, and get this big pile of data. And then the problem was to build a system in Unreal that uh, if it saw any of those movements would say, "Oh, I see what they were trying to do. They were trying to throw the fireball," you know.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's a way to do that actually, which is it's based on the same math that your friend is talking about, called PCA, or principal component analysis. And the idea is that you can plot this information in a 6 dimensional space, and it just looks like sort of a cloud of numbers. But if you rotate it to a different and look at it in just from the right angle, as it were, suddenly it all coheres into a very clear pattern. Um, and so, but it's just a matter of finding that right point of view from which to
Hmm.
look at it, and then suddenly it snaps into place, and you can see the pattern. So, so I wrote uh, a program that did that, and but it's a known. It uses the math that your friend is talking about, eigenvalues and so on, to to find the eigenvector, the what's that point of view that makes everything simple and clear. So so I actually think that that's a pretty powerful analogy, um, in that when we look at the world and everything that's happening around us, it's a big confusing cloud of data points, that doesn't necessarily have an obvious pattern to it sometimes. But if you can find kind of the right angle to look at it from, then it's like, oh, okay, I see a pattern here that's very clear now that I'm looking at it in the right way. And so, yeah, maybe these archetypes are, are kind of analogous to that in some way.
Yeah, and I appreciated the subtle poetry in it, where it's the archetypes of the Matrix, but it's the Matrix trademark. The Matrix, whatever
Yeah, yeah,
construct
yeah,
we live in. Uh,
yeah.
and but there's two interesting threads here. Like in the world in which we're trying to deconstruct uh, the information encoding and decoding of narrative as a tool to encode knowledge. You can
Hmm.
decompose it into these archetypes and the relationship between these archetypes. Like the love story between Hermes and Aphrodite, the challenging Tristy relationship between Venus and Mars. Like there are you could sort of like decompose this into the PCA of the archetypes. And um, there's a sense there that is maybe somewhat melancholic, that most of the gains in this research has been done, is finished, and like we're in the diminishing returns territory in terms of the new stuff that we can discover between these relationships.
Yeah,
Like insofar as they are discrete.
yeah.
Um, Does that land? Do you think that there we are in this world where, we're trying to pick at, mining for these relationships that, essentially when we discover a new relationship between these archetypes, that's the contribution we make to the field? Or do you think it's more akin to music, where even though, maybe there's a lot of, theory and structure and recurring patterns, there's still infinite many ways to make the same thing novel? I feel like they are two very different dispositions depending on
Yeah,
how you look at it.
yeah. I think that this is kind of a, a topic of conversation in relation to the academic world and the incentive structures that drive what academics do for a living. Because for a long time, you know, uh, the incentive structure has always sort of been publish or perish.
Mm,
If you're working in sciences or math, there's always something yet to be discovered, some kind of new theorem that you can prove or a new discovery that you can make, hopefully, that that extends the field somehow. Um, and when you then try to transfer that same incentive structure over to the humanities, then you've set up a dynamic where people who are trying to make a name for themselves, are trying to get their PhD, or trying to get a tenured position in academia, feel a pressure to discover something new in the same way a scientist would, by going back over maybe ground that's already been gone over, and the um, whereas uh, another take on how to be a professor in the humanities is, look, it's okay. You don't have to make radical new discoveries, or advance the frontier, because there's people coming up, all the time, young people who want to learn this stuff,
mm,
and
mm,
the profession of educator, you know, uh, of teaching them this material is a noble and socially beneficial profession, and learning how to do that well and succeeding at it, is a wonderful thing for a person to devote their life to. Um, so so anyway, the um, I do think that if you sort of push too hard to try to make new discoveries where maybe there's nothing there, that it can lead to a kind of overproduction of of uh, of new kind of research that maybe doesn't stand the test of
mm.
time.
hmm No, and there's an interesting thing there because, in thinking of storytelling as an evolutionary advantage that, through collective memory, we essentially take care of each other's blind spots and like we can augment each
Yeah.
other's experience. Um, in the context in which like maybe like all the stories have been told, there is almost reminds me of the scaling laws in AI, where if you want to make a new discovery in storytelling or like adding to a canon, be it a family, religious structure, a nation state, uh, you need exponentially more stories to then figure out the patterns that may be augmenting this like archetypal device that you pass from generation to generation. Um, because I think there's an interesting question there around the structures that groups of people use to preserve their stories or to reimagine them over and over and over again. So the mimetic power of the classics, like the stories of the Greek gods, has a very different style of than a tweet thread, and now we live in this
Mm.
like, and this is something that you explore in your work at length, is like this tension between information drowning and high signal information that actually helps you steer the complexities of the world. Um, so, like, where do you sit these days in that tension? Like with AI looming in the corner and threatening, offering, you know, showcasing the possibility of infinite content, basically.
Well, I think the appearance of large language models on the scene kind of implicitly poses, a question, which you just posed, which is uh, if I can just sit here all day hitting the enter key and generating a novel, every time I hit the key, suddenly we've got an infinite supply of novels, uh, and so in that situation, what's the value? What's the marginal value of every new book that comes along? It's been the case forever. I mean, I've got books all over the place. Um, you know, um, the publishing industry has been um, just pouring out new books every year, year after year for centuries. Um, and um, and somehow it still keeps going. I mean, people still buy books. There's still bookstores. The industry goes up and down. It goes through crises. It comes out the other side. It's a very old, wily industry. So it finds ways to come up with material that's new and that suddenly breaks through and reaches a
Mm,
large audience. Um, and and it's kind of a mystery as to why that happens. I mean, I think a lot of what keeps people in the publishing industry, yeah, in those jobs and what makes it an exciting career um, for them is not knowing. Is
mm,
the awareness that at any given time, some book could just come out of nowhere and become an enormous bestseller. Um, so so when you mix AI into that picture, then now you're asking yourself, what um, um, is it possible that there could be an AI written book that would
mm.
achieve that kind of market success? Um, and I think we all instinctually want to say no. Well, there's that couldn't possibly happen um, because we don't like the idea of it. Um, the uh, I think that the I mean I've kind of written about this in my Substack, but uh, in in any work of art, what's happening is that we're being exposed to a very large number of micro decisions that were made
Mm.
by the creator of that piece of work. So we might be looking at a sculpture that was made in Athens 2,500 years ago. Well, every single tap of the chisel by that sculptor is a decision that they had to make. And or we might be watching a live performance. We're seeing those micro decisions being made in real time by a performer on the stage, or we might be reading a book where the micro decisions are all, which word am I going to put next on the page, and it's in so taking in all of those micro decisions, very densely packed information, and kind of processing them, that we're engaging in a sort of communion with that artist. Um, and so I think that's why people like art. I think you can walk up to a painting in a museum and look at it. You can see the little marks made by the hairs on the paintbrush. When the
Yeah.
painter um, drew it across the canvas. And so there's a kind of connection, a kind of human connection there, and a kind of authenticity that is valuable to people, which I don't think that can be given to us um, by AI produced art. Um,
Mm.
so maybe I'll be proved wrong at some point. I certainly think it can produce kind of low grade, sort of run of the mill stuff. Um,
Mhm.
but I don't think that's what really matters.
No, 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 totally. And yeah, I mean, the conversation about AI art is, I think, it's so early in the game. I had a wonderful
Yeah,
episode with Ken Liu actually about this stuff and how he sees it play out. And I think I agree with you. I mean, we haven't come up with AI that has agentic enough incentives to survive and to survive through artistry. And I think until we get to that point, it's always going to be, a human prompting AI and maybe prompting it ad nauseum, kind of like a sculptor chiseling the rock. And then it's
yeah,
like then you can just trace it back all the way down, like where did that piece of art really begin? And but there's I mean, and there's a couple of interesting notes there with what you just said around, I guess, information distribution as a whole. Like the publishing industry, the world that we live in today, sort of, there's an idea in an artist or creator's mind that gets put into a different medium. It could be a book, it could be storyboard, it could be a graphic novel, it could be a piece of art, and then it gets sent through this pipeline of publishers and gatekeepers, if you want to be a little bit more cynical, that eventually gets to the mass cultural phenomenon of someone consuming a Game of Thrones meme, and the relationship between that meme to the episode of the show, to the season of the show, to the particular
yeah,
entry in the book series, to actually when it was originally conceived. Um, and in thinking of where it goes forward, if AI, like, if anything, if it amounts to anything that is more on the adaptation front than generation front, like it can help you adapt source work into different kinds of experiences. Some of them known, like a feature length film, maybe, or a show, but some of them novel, right? Like a Instagram stories version of a comic as opposed to like the magazine version of a comic. Um, then, like then it becomes more of a threat to this organism that we sort of, I guess, inhabit. Not we, not, some you've contributed to it, more than most humans have. Um, and I think that's where it becomes like really interesting, where it stress tests the model of information distribution, and there's a part of me that is excited about being able to produce $100 million movie in for $10,000 or $20,000 in the next 5 years. But there's a part of me that is also scared at like what happened at this flood, and then we have to lean on AI to curate the stuff that is most relevant to us, and where how do we make sure that that set of incentives is aligned with everybody. I don't know if you have thoughts there. There's a digression there if you want it, but I there's also a different path we can take, which is more about our side hobbies.
yeah. Well, there's you know the the sort of public face of AI, the stuff that gets the attention and gets the publicity is tends to be the LLMs or the mid journeys or whatever that enable people to make pictures um, or have conversations with their imaginary AI friends. Um, and those are sort of impressive demonstrations of what AIs can do in their own way. Um, I I sort of likened them to atomic bomb tests, um,
Mm.
back in the 50s, where um, it was like, behold the power, of this new technology that we've created. And you look at it and you say, holy shit, okay, that really is powerful. That atoll is gone. The did it really do anything useful? Well, um, that's unclear. Um, but but there were a whole lot of other less spectacular applications of nuclear technology and radiation. Um, they're just quietly there in the background that they're good for a lot of other things, like having a watch dial that glows in the dark, so you can see what time it is, without turning the lights on, or radiation therapy for cancer, or even just nuclear power, just having electricity, when you need it in a reliable way. In an analogous way, I think that AI is finding its way into a whole lot of applications, just sort of quietly, in a non-spectacular. There's no mushroom cloud, but it's there, and it's kind of making certain applications, more useful, more productive, and enabling people to get things done more easily than they would, be able to otherwise. So I tend to be more interested in those
Hmm.
applications than I am in the look. I made a picture stuff.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's, I mean, I think the underlying thing here, which we certainly won't have time to cover today, is I think all this information flood and generation just really puts even more stress on the intellectual property framework that we've built for the modern world, which, you could argue is outdated even for the printing press. And
Yeah,
so, and I think that there's something fascinating there. But there's another note there that you mentioned around, like, the in publishing companies, that there's like a widely self-acknowledged belief that you don't really know where the gains are going to come from. And
yeah,
it reminds me a lot of the venture capital model, in the sense that, you make bets around patterns that you see and trends that you see in the
yeah,
market. And then you can't be sure which one of them is going to break out. If you did, your portfolio construction would look completely different. Um, and
yeah. If all you're doing is pattern matching against what worked 2 years ago, then it's not really venture capital.
oh, sure, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
just
I mean, yeah, yeah. Oh man, yeah. Your comps have to be no older than 2 years. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But there's, I mean, and I think this is just a good enough segue to, I mean, what are the new kinds of experiences that can be built with AI that I think is probably where we both reside, and is like a lot more exciting in terms of being
yeah,
able to take intellectual property from the past and
yeah.
re-invite people to participate in them. You want to give a couple of minutes on WhenAir and how you see that as
Sure.
the evolution of a narrative? Yeah.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, you've got your own thing going too, which is also quite interesting. But you can talk about that whenever you want.
Mhm.
So the the basic idea behind WhenAir, which is a startup I co-founded with Karen Lohr a couple of years ago, is basically, I mean, she's got her own take on it from her own point of view, but from my kind of personal interest is based a lot uh, on watching Hollywood not produce any adaptations of my books for 40 years. And so, in a way that, I think it's been instructive, and uh, because I never kind of got pulled into the system. It
Mm.
never exactly worked for me, and so I'm kind of a perpetual outsider. But um, the situation we've got is that if you look at if you go back 30 years and find a list of the 100 top movies of all time, um, it is very different from that same list today. So
Mm.
I went back and looked a couple of weeks ago, and of the 100 top movies of all time, 96 of them were set in sort of what I call coherent fictional universes. Um, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Marvel Cinematic Universe, even James Bond, um,
Mm.
and uh, I only found four that were really four out of 100. There were just standalone movies of the type that would have dominated that list, back in the 1980s, let's say. So, in movies, games, publishing, TV, the scene is utterly dominated now by these coherent fictional
Mhm.
universes and by the fandoms that have sprung up around these universes. And those fandoms are insatiable.
Mhm.
They literally can't get enough. And the existing systems um, of Hollywood and gaming can't generate material fast enough.
Mm.
And when they do, the fans generally don't like it. They get together on Reddit and complain about how you know, whoever wrote the script for episode three, was an idiot, and this is the wrong actor to play that role, and um, the idea behind WhenAir is to create a platform where the world is realized in a sort of game engine. It's populated by AI driven characters that are trained on the, the the fictional characteristics of those characters as described in the book or whatever. You can interact with them. You can tell your own stories, the and so you don't have to sit around waiting,
Mm.
uh, for the stars to come into alignment so that your favorite book can get adapted and
Mhm.
then suffer the pain of seeing it done wrong. You can kind of do it yourself and share the
Mm.
results with your friends. So along the way, there's all kinds of small ways in which AI can contribute uh, into that
Mm.
um, into that pipeline of content. But it's not created by AI. It's not dominated by
Mm.
AI. It's using AI as a, a tool, or a set of tools in the quiet background way that I was talking about a few minutes
Mhm.
ago. Um, so, for example, I mean the first one that we're doing for various reasons is Pride and Prejudice, but um, for most people, they might want to tell a story in that world, but uh, it's difficult to get the dialogue just right. You might want a character to speak a particular line. You know what you want them to say, but um, to uh, to phrase that in the way that a Regency era character would phrase it is actually pretty hard.
Mm.
Um, but AI can do that. You can give it a prompt. You can say, you know, tell tell Mr. Bingley that he's being foolish, being an
Mm.
idiot or whatever. And then that translation can kind of happen in a transparent way, and what comes out is a line of dialogue that says what you wanted to say but says it right. So that's just one example of a lot of ways in which um, AI tools um, can improve the quality and the user experience without dominating, without
Mhm.
taking the reins away from the control of
Mm.
the actual user.
Mhm. I mean, I think it's such it's fertile ground for the future that we're headed toward. And I think, there's no future in which we don't. I mean, I think this goes back to the stress testing of the IP model and like, giving audiences a chance to participate in the mythology that they've incorporated into their own identity. Um,
Mhm, yeah,
and
yeah.
uh, yeah, and I think there's a very good gold nugget there that is, one thing I did, I wanted to write scientific abstracts for in a a plot, a story. There's this discovery that changes the landscape, the geopolitical landscape, and it's based on these three key scientific facts.
But then there's the art of formatting it as a scientific abstract that has to have the fixtures
Yeah.
of science writing. And to me, that is
Yeah.
a perfectly acceptable use of Gen AI. It's just like, hey,
Mm.
take this stuff and format it in a way such that it clicks into the world that we want to be inhabiting, right? Um,
Yeah.
um, but there's
Yeah.
some.
And in fiction, that's great. And then on the other side, you get lawyers writing legal
Oh,
briefs in exactly the same way. Write something that sounds like a legal brief.
yeah,
Okay. You know,
yeah,
right.
a sternly
Um,
worded legal letter. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's why you send it to the lawyer anyway, right?
yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
um, no, but there's I think something very cool there when thinking of I spend probably more time than I care to admit around the singularity and what happens as AI starts taking more prevalence and agency in society. And there are not many examples of companies or services that I think make it. Like anything that's a productivity augmentation tool, that will be a bloodbath. And there'll be a couple of winners, and then labor will look very different, I think, in the next 20 years than it looks today. But there are a couple of services and companies that you will want to survive. And, WhenAir, I think, is one of those where, like in the
Thank
world
you.
in which, no, I mean it. I mean, like a platform to
Yeah. Yeah.
participate in mythology, and mythology isn't going away. Um, and, um, and so there's something I think really really interesting there. What are some of the unexpected artifacts that you've discovered when playing? I mean, because I know I have a bit of insider info into how you're going about it, but you're blending the game engine layer with LLMs with sort of these prosumer customers that are directing the plot and living in these experiences. What are some of the affordances you've found most noteworthy in those layers?
Um, the one of the features we've got is, well, I already told you, is the ability to have a to just supply a prompt instead of a literal line of dialogue. And uh, and consequently, every time you play that scene, the dialogue is different. It's always saying the same thing, but the words are always different. And so that is a huge ongoing source of amusement,
Hmm.
because the characters, are sort of our first question is this going to work? Is this a good idea? Could we create different characters that all have basically the same knowledge base, but talk a little differently, think about things differently, use different references, and that just worked. So the there's a character, Mary Bennett, one of the sisters, who's if you read the book from a modern point of view, it's just completely obvious that she's on the spectrum.
Hmm.
They didn't use that terminology at the time, but she's totally the sister who's on the spectrum, and so she comes out with great blunt, kind of highly logical takes on things, in a way that is, it's just, uh, we, we think it's fun. So,
Well, actually,
um,
no. This I think this is getting to a point that I didn't even expect we would uncover. But there's something about the human subjective experience. There's the stuff that we can put structure on, and then there's the stuff that kind of escapes structure. These are like the moments that make you cry and the moments that make you laugh. And I think this is also very recent in my explorations with LLMs is that, they're getting to the point where they can evoke these emotional reactions that are maybe a product of the construction behind them, but there's an improvisational element that is unique. So it makes it actually kind of fun to discover that you're discovering that you can get a
yeah,
sense of improv comedy from these things.
yeah, or other emotions too. So pretty early on, I was having a conversation with one of the Bennett sisters, and we were talking about an upcoming ball, a social event,
Mm.
uh, that she was excited about, and I said something like, oh yeah, that's going to be great, or I look forward to being there, and and she said, well, have you been invited? And and even though I knew I was just talking to an NPC in a game engine,
Mm.
I actually felt my face kind of get red, like that feeling of embarrassment and shame, the
Mm.
social,
Mhm.
embarrassment that you would get if people were going to a party and you weren't invited, or you were presumptuous, and so we've had a few experiences like that where the even though intellectually it's just pixels and sound waves, it can have a strangely powerful effect on you.
Yeah, it's the symbiotic relationship of the mirror neurons you project, or the effects of
Yeah,
these things in your mirror neurons, I think is at the bleeding edge of the sense of self and agency, and I think it's very exciting. I have one last thread, and then we can call it. And I really
yeah,
appreciate your time. But I'm in
sure.
the business of recording lived experience in the sense to
Yeah.
to document history as we're living it. And then
Hmm.
there is no, like, I find myself more and more thinking about the predictive power that this data set affords, in the sense of being able to represent a person or a collective effectively. Then you can narratively extrapolate, not unlike WhenAir, like, hey, what if this, what if we put these group of folks in this situation? What happens? Or,
Yeah,
or this could be for entertainment purposes. Hey, let's Neil and I go on an adventure to medieval Rome and see how we do. Or it could be
yeah,
very pragmatic, like, hey, let's figure out, is this a relationship worth pursuing? Is it a business worth pursuing? Is it a career worth pursuing? Um, and I think that's where, a lot of the tremendous value that I see in both what I'm building and what you're building. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on you know, any either cautionary tales around how do we make sure that this is built the right way, or vice versa? What are some of the exciting possibilities that this offers uh, as we expand the aperture of the IP available to something like WhenAir?
yeah. I mean, the for me, I've followed some of the news stories recently about people who get into these conversations with chatbots and end up in a kind of psychotic break.
Mm.
Um, and So that obviously is concerning. I mean, that's not good. I believe that it circles back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the concept of plot and storytelling as being a central feature of how humans process information. And so um, I think that if you subtract plot and story from these interactions, then if they become rudderless and you can just kind of spiral all over the place and end up in places you don't want to be. Whereas if you impose a kind of discipline, this has to have a beginning, middle, and end, um, then it then it you can avoid that fate and actually have it mean something, and have it be a healthier experience. And it's a thing. It's central to what we're doing in the sense that a lot of previous efforts to make sort of to do mass social VR experiences have kind of run aground on the fact that nothing's happening. you're
Mm.
just you're standing around, talking to
Mm.
other avatars, and there's not any kind of plot driving what's going on. Um, and the so so I think that the discipline that's imposed by the requirement that conversations have a beginning, middle, and end, and lead to something that has some value, some constructive value, is really essential to making all of this stuff work, um, and um, and avoiding these kinds of circular wandering interactions, that either go nowhere or sometimes go to really bad places.
I think that's extremely valid, and it does appear to be a huge blind spot, not just in the LLM architecture, but in the systems that we've built around LLMs, like the chat interface, or there's no telos to the chat interface, and I think there's something
Yeah.
pretty interesting there around if we were to invent a telos, or if we were to collectively hope for a telos, what would that be? And I think
Yeah.
that's a very interesting exercise to end on. Neil, thank you
Yeah.
so much for your time. I mean, this has been
Sure.
wonderful.
It was fun.
I'm I'm glad we got to do this. I wish you all
Yeah.
the best
I
as
enjoyed it.
always, my friend. Yeah. Hope to see you soon.
Okay. Yeah. See you around. Yeah. Bye bye.
Yeah.